This is going to be super high level stuff and very, very fast. And it's also very much in my interest because I've got a provocation over here that I need to throw with intelligence or with people and see if you can figure out what the hell to do with the information I've come up with. I don't know. So, here's still ethics. Broadly speaking, the important point, things that ethics are not. They're not opinions. They're not subjective. They're not relative. And they're not about being nice. I can go into a lot more detail about all of that at the later stage, but ethics are best understood as decision-making methodologies based on information. Should be treated no differently from any other science. They are softer sciences, but they are nonetheless. Insofar as ethics is based on opinion, it is a waste of time. Your favorite flavor of ice cream and my favorite flavor of ice cream means nothing from an ethical standpoint, largely because you can just change your mind, and it's completely valid, right? So, what ethics are? There's, broadly speaking, in my philosophy professor, nerd, and you heard me say this, but I say it all the time. Broadly speaking, only two real schools of ethics: rules and consequences. Within each of those, there's two that I want to look at. Two of each I want to look at today that are most relevant from an AI perspective. First and foremost, rules and consequences are exactly what they sound like. I'll go into the consequences of all that in a second. Virtue ethics, right? Virtue ethics is one you're probably most familiar with when people talk about ethics. They're things like honesty, justice, fairness, human rights, but big, broad concepts. They're very, very useful because they apply to virtually every situation. Virtually everyone understands what you're talking about when it comes up, right? Can anyone see a problem with using that to make decisions? Right. What the hell are we talking about? What do you mean by honesty? Seriously. You ask, I won't do it right now because I don't have the time, but the thing I usually do on a question like this sort of thing is get everyone to write down the definition and then read it out. And guess what? Everyone disagrees. And here's the problem. Everyone will be assuming everyone else agrees with them. And now we've got a problem, right? So they are very high level guidance. They are very useful if you're trying to get a sort of a standard across a group. But if you get into the detail, they fall apart basically immediately. Now, where this becomes a challenge for the AI field, remember fair and care, virtue ethics, right? Good general guidance. Care in particular, you should have seen my face when that came up because what's the E in care stand for? Ethics. Super helpful, thanks for that. Deontology, by contrast, is one you're probably very familiar with. You probably don't think about it as ethics. Deontology is just a fancy word for a set of strict rules. Law is a standard process here, but also human research ethics. You remember that process? I don't know if you had a chance to read the national standard. It's extremely detailed, and it is not ambiguous, and it has clear consequences for contravention. Yep, your research will not be approved. Pretty straightforward, right? Law is the same thing. Policy is also very similar to this, right? Does everyone know? If you've got a scholarship, then you know the rules, and you know what happens if you breach said rules. And if you don't know what happens, and you don't know the rules and you breach them, doesn't matter. It still applies to you, right? You don't think of that as ethics, but it is very much ethics. There's soft versions of that as well, so social norms will often fall under that. There's a whole bunch of rules that we all abide by every day that we don't, strictly speaking, have words for. Yeah. Okay. Now, everyone's familiar with that. That is pretty straightforward when it comes to ethics. What isn't is this. So, consequences. Making a decision based not on whether it applies to any given set of rules, but based on the quality of the outcome. As you can imagine, this gets slippery really, really fast. It is, however, the way you actually do ethics. Now, broadly speaking, two flavors of this, both kind of flavors of the same thing. Utilitarianism, for example, comes down to the idea of maximizing the benefit and minimizing the harm in any given situation. Now, that is brutal in ways you probably can't fully appreciate, and I don't have the time to go into, but this isn't just, generally speaking, go with and try and maximize it. No, there is exactly one acceptable course of action. One. Everything else is unacceptable. It is brutal. Of course, we don't enforce this because it's virtually impossible to do so, but at the same time, that's ethics. This is really good because it works in any given situation, no matter how novel, no matter how much information you do not have. Aliens can land in the middle of the AFL Grand Final and we could still use this method. Because all it asks is that you take into account all the available information, judge it rationally, look at your options and go with the one with the maximum benefit and minimum cost. Yeah? Now you'll notice that that's actually been incorporated into the human research ethics as well. There's a demand as part of the rules that you do this calculation. Now, Can anyone see a problem with that? That's my go-to, incidentally. That's the one I would traditionally use in a professional environment.
Marginalized.
So,
Definition of benefit and harm.
excellent. Who's doing the calculation? You are. How are you doing it in your own head? What's the standard? There isn't one. You're making it up, right? Now, that's not to say it can't be done objectively, but now we're talking rigor. We're talking evidence. We're talking external assessment. And no one wants to have to do that because it's a real pain in the backside. The one exception is academia. You have to do ethics approval as part of all of your projects. Meanwhile, Facebook can just do it. See what happens. Don't care really. Makes money, right? So everyone actually does this, and you do it all the time. You're doing it right now. You can stand up and leave right now. There's absolutely nothing stopping you from doing that. You're just choosing not to, right? Because you're judging that sitting down and listening is probably maximum benefit, minimum cost. But there's absolutely nothing stopping you from just going, I've had enough of that, right? Jaywalking, who's broken the law this week? Yeah, you all have, right? Why? Why do you cross the road against the lights? Because it's faster and there's no cars coming. If there were cars coming, you wouldn't do it. Because you die. The real warriors amongst us might. Okay. Feminist care ethics is an evolution of the same concept. Is anyone familiar with that term? You may have heard of it as care ethics. Excellent. Great. Yeah, good to see it around. Feminist care ethics is it's a bit of a weird name, but it is relevant. So this is basically the same calculation of maximize benefit, minimize cost, but it takes into account the fact that powerful people get to make these choices most of the time. Most of the theory itself is developed by people that look like me without their hair. So rich, white, old, established. That is the norm. Now that doesn't mean that the theory is invalid. This theory is still excellent, right? That's not the point. The point is that when you make the calculation, definitions, biases come into play, and this is incredibly vulnerable to bias. Everyone thinks they're making the right decision, otherwise they wouldn't be making that decision, would they? They will think that the costs are justified, right? Are they? Well, without external rigor, there's no way of telling. This demands that you incorporate the views of people affected by the decision, regardless of whether you think it will impact them or not. It's external rigor built into the system. Now, the long and short of all of this is that rules, both of these are extremely valid ways of doing ethics. But they both have weaknesses. Rules are strong, but they're stupid, right? You will never, especially when it comes to the field of AI, be able to write a set of rules that govern every situation you are likely to encounter, largely because we have no idea what the risks are yet. I mean, the most recent version of Claude just launched and hacked straight through the CIA's security. How the hell do you guard against that if you don't know that it's possible? And how do you know if it's possible until it happens? Right? It's not like they designed it to do that. Yeah? Similarly, actually, over with that one, who would have anticipated that people would form romantic relationships with AI agents? Seriously? And if you can't anticipate it, you cannot govern for it. As such, writing a set of rules for it. Virtual ethics can sort of be used in this general sense, but again, it's so loose that, yeah, okay, how are you going to use fairness in that context? What does that mean? Right? It's a generally good guide, but it's not enough. Consequentialism and utilitarianism and feminist care ethics, on the other hand, can adapt to these situations. They're all risk-based because they're always forward-facing. Yeah? What is the likely outcome of this approach versus this approach versus this approach? Therefore, what should we do to incorporate governance into this to prevent harm? This one in particular is extremely relevant to AI ethics because it requires you to take into consideration the impacts on people that will be using it regardless of your intentions. There is not a single AI company or user of AI that doesn't think it's worth it, right? That's not the point. Your intentions as a general rule with ethics are completely irrelevant. I don't care what you intended. Doesn't matter. What happened? Was it predictable? Could you have intervened? Right? Yeah. So, any questions about the theory? Incredibly fast introduction to the details. The point is not that you shouldn't use or should use any of these. The point is that you already do use all of these, and they have strengths and weaknesses. You must manage all the weaknesses, otherwise you will make a mistake. Again, being an academic, So this is irrelevant because you're already held to a very high standard and hold yourselves to a very high standard. But the problem with, of course, emerges that, especially here, super easy. Does it affect the community? Fine. We had a little bit of backward and forward on that the other day about accountability, right? Yeah. How do you make sure that the people that you are impacting with your project are benefited by it? And I mean actually benefited by it, not just like it all. There is no way of doing that without gathering the data. And when you're talking about risk, there is no data. So you need to incorporate them into the planning. Otherwise, you don't know what their interests are, and therefore you can't govern to prevent harm. Right? Cool. Okay, so this is where we go over to a bit of a provocation. Remembering again, rules and consequences, right? Now, hands up if you're familiar with a sigmoid function and a linear regression. Or if you're just flat out not. Everyone's vaguely familiar with these concepts, right? Because I'm very new to these concepts and I was reading about them and I had a little bit of a moment where I was like, hang on a second, these look familiar. Sigmoid function attempts to classify data into either one category or the other category, right? Very straightforward, but I would like to bring attention to this bit here. Gray spaces, right? Does it precisely fit? Now, you can get that line as vertical as you like, but at some point it's got to cross over the threshold, meaning there will always be ambiguity. There's always an opportunity for ambiguity. That is rules. That's deontology. That's yes or no. It either fits inside the rule set or it does not fit inside the rule set. But just with the sigmoid curve, it also has a problem over in deontology that there's always going to be edge cases. And your rules cannot adjust for that. Because not everything fits. There'll always be novel situations, there'll always be ambiguity, etc., etc. Secondly, linear regression, and I apologize, my own job. An attempt to fit a data set to the ideal situation by taking a vibe, we go upwards or downwards, and slowly mapping down to the ideal data point, right? In other words, the data is not ideal. The data is what you have. You're training the machine to find the best fit for all the available data. So you have a hypothetical perfect spot, right? But the data doesn't fit. So what you're doing instead is training the machine to get as close to it as humanly possible. Making sense? Assuming I've got the correct definition of that.
I think you tried to talk about gradient descent.
Gradient descent, quite right, sorry. Regression, gradient descent. Anyway, training it to best fit the available data without actually being able to accomplish that. Right? That's consequentialism. There is no perfect answer, but we're going to go with the best bet we have available, maximizing the benefit and minimizing the loss, minimizing the cost. Now, I don't know what to do with this, bluntly put. The fact that the two computational methods for training AI come down to two ethical frameworks seems like it's significant. And I have not the faintest idea what to do with the information. But there are three questions that occurred. One, we noted a whole bunch of issues with those two ethical frameworks, right? Weaknesses inherent to the system. Are those being managed in these computational frameworks? Because they have the same weaknesses. One, not everything fits into your arbitrary categories. And two, this is only as good as the data you fit. If you put in bad data, it's going to give you a bad result, right? Not to mention the quirks of these models, meaning that there can be false bottoms here, meaning that you thought it was maximum benefit, minimum harm. It wasn't. I don't know. But then again, how hard can you actually look? Second question I have is, how does this fit in? Virtue ethics. You've got strict rules and you've got consequences here, but what about broad fit the high-end principles? Now, in terms of accountability within these systems, it occurs to me there might be an additional function we could add in here that may exist that I'm simply not aware of. Is your ideal point, your value, your virtue, how fast or close does your outcome fit to it? And the further away it goes, the less acceptable it becomes. That's sort of like a validation process. And again, that may already be reflected in this other two, but I'm not really clear on it. So I just sort of want to throw it to the group and see if there was any thoughts about this. Yeah, I think that's my 20 minutes. So, yeah.
Just a suggestion, and it would be great to hear the group whether k-means clustering, single clustering, which fits the fudge. So k-means would be.
K-means, was it?
Yep. I think it uses you if it tries to minimize it.
Yeah.
So it's similar to library regression.
Right.
It's three-dimensional.
Right in the center.
Yeah, well, that's the learning process.
Yep. I will emphasize that I very much know Jim when it comes to computation, like the ethical stuff in my bag. Yeah.
So one thing that we try to emphasize, at least on the quantitative side, especially at the foundation, is like when we're really learning how to use like any form of regression, right? At least that's the way I would that. When we try to play with data, right, when we're running and estimating our models, we need to be careful not to actually fall too deep into them, right? Because every single model we ever use is wrong. Right. Yeah. They're at best generalizations and attempts that represent the world, right? So you can get into the epistemological side if you really want to, but in the end, it really comes down to these are just simply approximations, right? So I think that fits with like what you were asking, your first question, right? Because any single model, like you vary that model 50 different ways if you want to, right? Every single one is wrong. It doesn't actually represent how the world is in minute detail, right? Because quantitative analysis can't do that, right? That's not the point. The point is to look for as many relationships as we can, find the potentially most accurate way to model what the world looks like, right? And then talk about those relationships, find that those relationships can inform us about how the world actually works. And chances are it never will, right? Even if you get into some of the causal stuff in political science, if you go that, and that's my bit, right? So going to causal inference, like I could teach you like I've done a workshop at Midwest, so I can teach you like 5-6 different ways of using causal inference techniques. Every single one of them only works within the context of that data, right? So if I were to give you any advice, I guess it might be to maybe think about the ethical or even accurate parameters associated with data collection, right? Even the data output, right, for this project is probably only right to the extent that I'm using it in certain ways and filtering out for certain things, right? It's not going to be a perfect approximation of how the world works, but that's also not the point of quantitative analysis, right? But we often fall too deep into that, that framing. So it's like, yeah, this is a causal effect. Yes, it is, but only within your data set until you go collect new data, run it again, and see if you get the same thing, right? So I'm not sure if that helps you in any way.
No, it really does. It's really
Work like videos wrong. Okay. They have a bit. They do a bit more ethics than I am. Involved. And I think the problem is like what they're doing now is like we don't know data input, so they try to visualize that. I understand how when the mod is given this wrong, they started visualizing in the article like how a part of the conceptual, they have a conceptual map is like when this is like activated, something like that. And I think even before going to all of this nothing the math as a model which has been developed for many years. We don't really understand. We have to go back and understand data. And I think one of the keyword I like that you talked about before is intermediate. A lot of the time, the marginal algorithms don't have a tool or anything to intervene with this process. And all this framework we have now is so high level. So I really like feminist ethic, but I also feel like we are living in terms of identity politics. So any mention of feminism just now just
Yeah, it's not less close problems. So I agree with that, but at the same time, yeah, that kind of broadcast is not necessary. But thank you, that's really helpful.
It's actually a good point. Today on the train, I read that probably about hiring a lot of philosophers now, and then a lot of like historians and people from academia just to understand what it all means because they've been chasing all these mathematical models, and then there is no proper. You need conceptualization, and then not everything can be represented in a graph, and not everything can be included in that model. That's why we have different models. That's why different models disagree. That's why we get different outputs, and that's why models perform differently because they function
on the foundational level, the function of the different assumptions, basically. Yeah. So I guess theoretical. I guess not thinking too much about how it's all represented mathematically, but rather coming up with a coherent story, a coherent relationship between theory, and then, for example, combining these, strong but stupid and then smart, but by putting them all together, I think that's where most of the work needs to be done. Otherwise, all these methods and models, they're useless. So because qualitative is most important work. The models are just a representation of what we already know. And there are things we don't really understand and don't really know. So, I agree absolutely with the point of causal inference. That's basically what you need to do before you actually come up with a coherent mathematical model. Because you need to know what causes why X causes Y. And then, for example, you need to understand why these models, for example, why smart utilitarian frameworks are smart, and where the weaknesses come from, and how you, I guess, strengthen them. So I guess that would be on the side of misunderstanding.
I think you're on point. It's a very good question.
I guess the question that I will ask you is going to be a really mean one, but it's a question, so what, right? It's usually a question that you want to ask yourself when you want to write a paper, make an article, make an intervention into the field, right? So I guess one point of sort of start might be looking at existing approaches. If you are interested in AI, and we're talking about a topic before, they use constitutional approach, right? You've probably heard of people.
Yeah.
The AI constitution. So I think it's a virtue-based. Written by a philosopher as well. So if there are, I guess, interventions or suggestions that you can make on how they currently do things, based on your, theoretical and computational understanding, that might be really useful. And maybe one way of answering that sort of question, I'll suggest you some.
Appreciate it. So to answer that, the main reason for doing this, the reason for my PhD is nearly all discourse that it's in AI and tech in general, to be honest, sitting here.
Yeah.
It's going to eventually get to here when the government regulates, but that's going to take friggin' decades to understand it. But this is still insufficient. This is wildly insufficient. You need this. So think about this in terms of just criminal law, right? Criminal law sits here, but it functions here. Like, the law doesn't stop me from going and killing someone. I stop me from going and killing someone. The law can't stop me from.
Consequences stop you from doing that.
Right, exactly.
Your realization of consequences. And if you don't have this realization, you're probably gonna go and do it. That's why people believe.
We say deontologists are psychopaths in job because they're the only ones who you can't trust to make the decisions themselves, right? This is where the decision making actually takes place, and this is how the decision making is currently taking place when it comes to AI. It's just not accounted for and not managed. Hence the concern. What I'd like to get is the discourse to acknowledge that and to start to take that into consideration. Because at the moment, and this is not a problem just with AI or tech, it's a problem in the corporate world in general. It's like this gets done by profit, everyone else is wrong.
Sorry, have you looked at earlier? Because AI is basically a buzzword right now, right?
Sure.
And it's early adoption of everything. That's why everything is so messy. That's why we don't understand how it all functions, and there's no proper legislation. There's no way to properly legislate.
Yeah.
Have you looked at other important moments, for example, the internet, the emergence of the internet?
Yeah.
Because it was really messy at the very beginning, and we had all kinds of ethical issues with it. And it was pretty lawless, right? So I guess if you wanted to look at how AI will develop and then what ethical practices we could potentially adopt, we could possibly trace it back to all the other major points in history. So, for example, the internet, and then before that, I guess, where else? Libraries? No? Something similar, something that changed the world.
Fundamentally, all emerging technology goes through the same pattern.
Electricity.
It's just that some of them are more significant than others, like NFTs died, right? Or crypto sort of fizzled. But this looks like it's going to stick, and that means big consequences. So that puts it pretty much on the same scale as the internet, which I'd rather avoid repeating the same mistakes that we've done with those technologies and the consequences thereof. And considering my location and the opportunity to run it. So, legit, no, that's
With various kind of and what is
I'd love to hear more about where those conversations.
Mentioned feminist ethical theory to look into that. I would like want to look into the literature about harm written by some legal feminist scholar.
Mhm.
Is how they also the problem with the definition of harm is harm on the individual. Harm is normalized as well. So yeah, so I think like ethics is anyway now how we talk about to benefit women and to avoid harm.
And that's exactly the conversation that's okay. So, yeah, good point. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm probably quite behind on this, but in my head, it's like, so AI, if we're talking exclusively about AI and we're asking them to look more, utilitarian, but more consequence-based ethics, to then their definition, maximizing benefit, is always going to be maximizing benefit to themselves.
Yeah.
The only way to force, we would have to force them to try and maximize benefit while taking into account other, which kind of leans back into a rule-based ethical approach. Is there something I'm missing there, or is that just like the paradox of it?
This is a standard problem with ethics is that this should be how we do things, but unless there's some sort of enforcement approach, this just gets over. They're saying it's culture needs ethics for breakfast. So what's normalized inside an organization is absolutely going to be regardless of the actual ethics associated. When you say then, you're talking about the people that run the companies, or are you talking about the AI itself?
No, sorry, the people
Yeah.
it's purely like a profit motive. Like I look a lot of climate stuff, and it's like they will only do the bare minimum that will like cut off their. They'll spend the minimum amount of money to like meet the legislation, and then every time the legislation pops off it, they'll just continue to spend the minimum amount to meet that legislation. They're never actually going to go above and beyond to cut their profits.
Pragmatism, completely agree. So this is what we both basically is that this is constructive. This is destructive is not quite the right word, but progressive perhaps is basically what I said before about deontology for the psychopaths and children. Yeah, corporations can't have psychopaths. They can't trust them. Like for the simple reason is that everything inside the organization is incentivized for profit. So previous work, my work history, the previous work I've done is included with the financial sector after the the Banking Royal Commission and the Victoria Police. And in both cases, you are not changing that culture. You're regulated what this is. And that's the only way you're meaningfully going to make any change in those places. And so the people, and even then, to be honest, it's got to be upstairs. It's all that top stairs managers sup up person and it's as simple as that. So that said, we sort of also want to, this is a bit of a looming thing at the moment of like what governments tend to do in these spaces is to over-regulate. So the under 16 age man, for example. I mean, yeah, valid intent, but the method by which I went about it was freaking hand-fisted. And it's clearly an experiment. Do you remember drones? You remember drones when they were first out? It was just freaking everywhere. There was whole cottage industry. It was great. And some idiot flew one into restricted airspace. And the next thing you know, in a light air kind of license to fly anything over a certain size. That's what they'll do if they're like. So we need to find a middle ground, essentially, which involves combining this and also this reasonable legislation. So yeah, it's an extremely on point at that point. Anyway, thank you for indulging me. I appreciate it.